p.m. Eastern on MSNBC, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Democrat from California. She was an election observer in South Africa when Mandela was elected president and worked on the legislative effort that removed Mandela and the ANC from America's terrorist watch list. Rev, truly one of the greatest figures of our time.
Probably one of the greatest figures of all time. I think that you cannot take lightly that the ANC and Nelson Mandela were considered terrorists by much of the Western world, including the right wing here. And for Mandela to emerge as a prisoner, negotiating privately at great risk, even at the great risk of some that were supporters of his, who didn't know about the negotiations until later, and for him to take that move of reconciliation and lead that country into an election. I was an election observer. I remember Barbara Lee. I don't think she was in Congress yet. I have a picture of her and Danny Glover and all of us at the Carlton Hotel. And it was an amazing time to see people lined up the first time they could vote, and for miles and miles, for 3 days. And they didn't vote on individuals, they voted on parties. Mandela always talked about him and others, and he talked about the party. But to go from terrorist to being the kind of celebrated statesman, people shouldn't sweep past that. He suffered. Many of his colleagues suffered. Decades in jail, ostracized. Never thought they'd see daylight again as free people, but they took that and transformed that country. And I was glad to be there to witness it. I was with him when he went to the UN and asked for the removal of sanctions. To be around this man who had such gravitas but humility at the same time was an awesome experience.
Congresswoman, you were there, if I'm not mistaken, as the Reverend was just mentioning, to see that first Democratic election in South Africa in which Nelson Mandela was elected the first Democratic president of that country.
I was there, and let me say, Chris, that my heart is very heavy tonight. The people of South Africa, the people of the world, we've lost a great warrior, a great leader. I also have to just say that the lessons that we have learned from President Mandela are so great. And being there as an election observer was one of the moments that I will always remember, because, you know, these elections were very difficult. Mm-hmm. When I landed, the first task we had was to monitor the, and Reverend Al, you may remember this, the cleanup of a bomb blast that was you know, blasted out in front of the ANC. One was in front of the ANC headquarters. I think 30 people died. And so these elections, Nelson Mandela did not take lightly. The people of South Africa did not take lightly, but they waited in line. It was a true exercise of democracy. We learned a lot from those elections. And President Mandela is still larger than life. His serenity, his tough spirit, he reminded me of a freedom fighter who won, and who once you won, he was on the right side of history. Then, in fact, this sense of peace, this sense of reconciliation, this sense of moving forward to develop and lead a multiracial society was the natural next step for him. If only we could learn that as a people here in our own country.
Yeah, there's so many different chapters to this man's life. He had so many incarnations as a young lawyer, as an activist, as a militant briefly, when the ANC decided to take up arms struggle, as a nonviolent activist, as a prisoner, then as a head of state, as an elder statesman. The bomb blast that Congresswoman just talked about, the threat of violence shot through everything in apartheid South Africa. And it constantly hung over everything.
It constantly hung over, and it never stopped. I remember when we landed, and the Congresswoman is correct, and dealing with the bombings. This was right before the election. Yeah. People act as though there was just this great epiphany. It wasn't. There was resistance from the Afrikaners all the way through. There was those on the other side, members of the PAC, that didn't believe in the reconciliation. It was only, as she used the term, the serenity and the level-headed leadership of Nelson Mandela and others that was able to bring balance and bring us through a very dangerous period globally, because it was a global movement.
There are these very rare figures in history who are graced with a certain kind of moral and spiritual genius. Mandela, Gandhi, King are the three, I think, that come most quickly to mind, that are able, almost it seems single-handedly, Congresswoman Lee, to, almost as Moses parted the waters, to bring, through their leadership, through their grace, to bring nonviolence out of the storm clouds of violence and hate and rage.
And yet they're the victims of hate and rage. And so the lessons that we learn from them should be very important as in our daily lives as we struggle for peace and for justice. Spending 27 years in prison, unbelievable. I mean, how many people could come out of prison not bitter, not angry? How many of us could move forward and make peace with our enemies? How many of us could move forward and lead a country out of an era of brutal apartheid into an era of global leadership and still remain humble, lead with humility and with gratefulness? President Mandela, I remember when he came here the last time. You know why he came here to this country? To thank people for their support in the solidarity movement, in the anti-apartheid movement. And he just came to say thank you. What a sense of humility and an awesome spirit this man had, and his spirit is going to live forever.
I want to talk about the particularities of this man's life and some of the different chapters of it. And most specifically, next, I want to talk about the nature of the apartheid regime, which is so removed from us that I think we know it was a racist regime, but it was a truly evil entity. It was a truly outlaw regime. And what his life as a prisoner and in hiding looked like, and how that